Today is a really big day because we're getting ready to bottle a 120-minute IPA. 120 is an India Pale Ale that gets its name from the 2 full hours it spends in the boil kettle. It's one of our most celebrated beers, and it's the world's strongest IPA. A beer like 120 has 20 times the hops of a normal beer. It has 5 times in weight the barley of a normal beer. It takes like 3 months to brew instead of 10 days for a normal ale. So the commitment in ingredients and time and labor and love and coddling and yeast is off the charts compared to the average beer. That's why this beer costs $8 or $10 per 12-ounce bottle. But because that beer costs $10, we have an obligation to the kind of beer enthusiasts that would pay that kind of premium for a special beer to make it absolutely as perfect as we can. All told, 120 uses up more ingredients, manpower, and time than any other beer we brew, which is also why it's far and away the most expensive for us to make. But that doesn't mean it's easy. The high alcohol content of 120 is achieved by using an outrageously high ratio of yeast during fermentation. The challenge of this? Yeast has trouble surviving in super high alcohol environments, and if the yeast underperforms, the beer will fail.
Today's panel, the last sample they receive will be a 120-minute IPA, and they're going to profile this beer for me and let me know what their thoughts are on it based on appearance, aroma, flavor, mouthfeel, and what their overall impressions are of this beer. Is it what we have strived for? What do you think? All right?
I'm not getting the kick, not getting the alcohol, and it's real thick, real syrupy.
Really?
Yeah.
It's rare that a beer gets this far along that we'll have a detrimental issue with it. But, you know, things do happen. What's going on? What do you think?
Well,
Yay, nay?
it's a little off.
In what regard?
I feel it's a lot different. It's not our typical 120. It's very, very sweet.
Okay. What you think, buddy? You all right with it?
Sweet.
Still sweet?
Yeah.
That seems to be the consensus. These lights for the next hour continue to go off and on. And once 11:30 comes and I tear the whole panel down, I finally have the ability to sit down at my desk and digest what just happened.
Uh-oh. Trouble in 120 Paradise. This is big beer for us. It's a money maker. It's pays a lot of bills, and we're gonna have to get to the bottom of this one. So.
The 120-minute IPA we profiled based on where the data falls on the P chart. This could very much be a major problem. Overall, the beer is really too sweet and sort of syrupy. The analytics didn't quite add up, so I'm gonna have to let management know that we may have a major issue here with this 120-minute.
This giant batch is taking up precious real estate on the brewery floor. It's holding up production of the other beers in the pipeline.
You get news like this sometimes, and I just feel dizzy and like I might throw up. Having kind of one of those whirlwind moments that it's a little disorienting and damn, we gotta deal with this.
All of this is happening right at the same time I'm headed off to Maine to do more research on the cedar-aged beer. I'll have to keep close tabs on this problem from the road, because if we can't figure out how to quickly fix this beer, $500,000 of our labor and love goes down the drain. 120-minute IPA is one of the most important beers at Dogfish. It takes over 3 months to brew, and it costs us more to make than any other beer. 120 received unsatisfactory marks from our sensory panel. And if we have to dump it down the drain, we stand to lose $500,000.
We got a batch in the balance here. I mean, it's inevitable that with 40-something beers in process in different tanks, one of them's going to be not in its ideal condition, but when I'm going to find out if this one's DOA or capable of reviving.
We need to quickly determine what the problem is and see if there's anything we can do to save this beer. Our yeast expert, Katrinka, will run tests on the suspect batch down in the lab.
Our options get more and more limited as time goes on, so we have to act as quickly as possible and start figuring out what the problem could be and then attacking it from there.
120 is an 18% alcohol beer. It's exceptionally difficult to brew. The more alcohol you want in your final beer, the more barley sugars you need to add in the brewing phase, and the more yeast you need to add to eat those sugars during fermentation. The difficulty is that super high alcohol levels can be toxic to the yeast and kill it off before it's done its job. Let's back up. Here's what yeast is supposed to do. We add yeast to a tank of wort or young beer. The yeast cells eat and eat, converting sugars in the wort into alcohol and CO2. The crass analogy is that yeast eats sugar, poops alcohol, and farts CO2. When yeast is not happy, it basically stops eating, falls asleep, and sinks to the bottom of the tank, leaving behind too much sweetness and not enough alcohol. 120 was dinged in sensory because the flavors were off. Since yeast has a huge influence on the flavor of beer, that's the first thing we're going to check.
So what we've done is taken a sample of very concentrated yeast and a sample of fermenter and combined them together for a few days and let them ferment.
This is what we call a forced fermentation.
The point of doing a forced fermentation is basically to test and make sure that all of the complex carbohydrates in wort were converted into simple sugars by the enzymes in the mash.
This test will determine if the batch of 120 still contains food for the yeast cells to eat. Katrinka's hope is that by adding more yeast to the beer and recirculating the yeast throughout the tank, the yeast cells will start eating again and get back to work, producing alcohol and CO2.
So we're putting the forced fermentation on the shaker table so it stays nice and agitated, and then in about 24 hours we'll be able to come back and see if the yeast made any difference.
If the forced fermentation works, the solution is simple. Add new yeast to the beer. But if it doesn't, we might be looking at the single biggest financial loss in Dogfish's history. Back at Dogfish, Katrinka gets some bad news about 120. The sugar levels or gravity of this batch of 120 are way too high.
That's a huge red flag to me, and that indicates that most likely there's something seriously wrong with the fermentation.
Although the sugar levels in the beer are much higher than normal, Katrinka's findings reveal that adding more yeast at this stage won't solve the problem.
Sugars aren't fermentable by the yeast, and even if there's a million times as much yeast as you'd possibly need to ferment, it still won't ferment. Unfortunately, I have the unlucky privilege of letting the big fishes know that we have an issue, and we have to kind of get the brain trust of Dogfish together and make some serious moves and put a big plan together.
Coming up, we try to avoid the worst case scenario for any beer, dumping it down the drain.
Oh no, you got charts out. That's never good.
At this late stage in brewing, it won't be just beer going down the drain, but all our hard work, pride, and a ton of money. Back at the production brewery in Milton, it's time to confront some tough issues. 120-minute IPA got dinged in sensory for being overly sweet and lacking its normal kick. The results of Katrinka's forced fermentation test didn't provide any easy solutions to the problem. Coming up, there's 2 batches of beer worth $500,000 stalled in their tanks on the brewery floor. I schedule a meeting with the guys to discuss what we do next.
120 Minute is one of our most high-profile, iconic sort of Dogfish signature beers. So you can imagine what an impact that's going to have on our cost and on our budget if it's 120 that we lose.
Two huge batches of 120-minute IPA are in limbo. $500,000 worth of beer hangs in the balance.
What's up, gentlemen? Oh no, you got charts out. That's never good.
I don't know how to say this.
I don't think it's very promising from where we're at right now. We've got some big decisions, I think, ahead of us.
The perception I'm getting through sensory is that it's a good beer, however, it's not what 120 is supposed to be.
The sweetness is one thing, but it also makes the hop characterization very different. Although it's brewed to recipe, it's not tasting to the profile.
It's a good beer, but it's not really a great beer.
It's too late to resuscitate these batches, I'm guessing. We've done oxygen, we've done yeast food. What if we do a few lengths, 2 or 3, of a totally different beer and get something really, really dry to blend in with this?
No, it is important to look at it because we're talking 400 barrels. Yeah. So 400 barrels times...
It's $500,000.
Yeah, it is real money here. So when we do that, at the moment, I cannot give you the guarantee that we're successful. What I'm trying to say is $500,000 is a lot of money, but ultimately, this is a big reputation issue.
While beer flavors can vary slightly from year to year, this batch of 120 is just too far off. We've exhausted every creative solution at our disposal. And in the end, we all agree about what must happen next. If a beer doesn't live up to our standards, we've got no choice but to dump it.
The right decision is to dump it.
I agree.
I think there is no question about that.
Looks like we're gonna have to dump a batch of 120.
It's always a huge bummer at Dogfish when beer gets put down the drain. Morale suffers all the way down the line. And because everyone at Dogfish is joined in the same profit-sharing program, the huge financial hit is lost on no one.
We're running full. I mean, we're 100% full. It's not like we have extra tanks. And if we had extra tanks, we'd say, hey, let's park it. Maybe there's a few other things we can try. We have to get it out of there as quick as possible because now you're holding up the ability to bring new beer through the system. So we need to rip the Band-Aid off and throw this down the drain.
The decision to dump a beer never comes lightly, but with the time and effort that we put into making all these beers, every single one of them is something that people here feel is a big part of them and a big part of their work. It's all of our livelihoods and a good portion of our lives.
All said and done, we're about 20,000 gallons that need to go down the drain in total, which is pretty substantial for us. It is probably the biggest short-term hit we've ever taken as a company. This one really does stink. We haven't had 120 for probably 3 months, and it's probably the biggest thing we get emails for. When's it coming out? When's it coming out? When's it coming out? But all of our attempts have failed. And unfortunately, this is a yeast issue. And while we somewhat control the yeast is a living organism, and there's only so much you can control it when you're at the ragged edge of its performance capability at that high of an alcohol environment. Before we attempt to make 120 again, we need to go back to the drawing board and figure out from the very beginnings of the brew house what broke down, how didn't it work, so that we don't have to put this beer down the drain.
We just dumped $500,000 down the drain. Before we brew another batch, we want to make sure we get things right. We're going to go and taste some vintage 120 in an effort to nail down the precise recipe and fermentation schedule we need to follow with this beer.
If we're gonna do a reset on 120 and literally go back to the drawing board on how we ferment it, we might as well go back to the drawing board and make sure we're all in agreement on what it should be. So it shouldn't just be, this beer is supposed to be 18%, this beer is supposed to be X final gravity. It should be, how's this beer supposed to taste?
Can we start with the youngest one?
The youngest one is 08, 120-minute brewed November 5th, 08.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Tasting beer happens in 3 stages. The aroma, or nose, hits you first, followed by the middle, and then the finish, which is the taste left lingering after you swallow. We'll also pay attention to things like body, mouthfeel, and appearance, because, as Flora says, the first taste is with the eye.
Has a very heavy cherry nose.
In the aroma or flavor?
In the aroma.
Yeah.
It's cherry and vanilla.
Almost cough syrup.
Cherry, vanilla.
I got isoamyl acetate, a lot of bananas.
Bananas.
This is 07. This is from October 10th, 07. This is actually 3 years to the day, so to speak.
Yeah, really different nose. I got a little more lemon.
And this really smells leathery to me, the second one.
Leather and lemons.
To me, this is rougher, less finished.
The 2007 vintage is a bit out of whack, but in some ways it's kind of encouraging to know that it hasn't always been perfectly on track.
So if you now open the third one, let's see if that works.
This is 2006.
Man, look how pretty this is. That's the prettiest of all.
Looks like sherry.
That's a beautiful beer.
I think this is a spectacular beer.
This is exactly what I hoped and dreamed for 120 minutes. And I feel like it's the exact granddaddy of the 08. This was like Hank Williams III, Hank Williams, and Hank Williams Jr. was all left up. Whereas the other two were fantastic. Do they teach that in brewing school, the Hank Williams?
That's actually what we learned in our first semester.
There's a whole semester of comparing your beers to one of the Hank Williamses?
Absolutely.
In Belgium too?
I don't know who Hank Williams is.
The 2006 is our clear favorite. The next step is to see if we can recreate that recipe. We'll give the exact specs to Brian down at the brew pub. On a small 5-barrel scale, he'll try to replicate exactly the recipe used 4 years ago. Room, we're bringing back the 2006 recipe of a 120-minute IPA. While recreating this vintage batch, we hope to find some answers on what went wrong with this year's version.
Recently, we've had a less than successful batch of 120 up in Milton, which we ended up dumping down the drain. So instead of just going full on up there and rebrewing it and potentially risking another catastrophic loss like that, we'll make something a bit smaller down here to test some things out.
120 needs a lot of attention. I think we're making the right decision in bringing this back to our R&D brewery in Rehoboth. Brian's gotten his direction, and the biggest variables are making sure that our mash temperatures are such that we've got a higher level of fermentability in there.
We'll never give up on making this beer perfect. 120 is responsible for a lot of what we are, you know? And aside from that, we just don't give up. I mean, the good thing about failure is that it really causes us to come together as a unified front to combat the forces of evil. Oh, I can't show you this. It's a secret. You can't get in the reflection. I have it set on no reflection.
Using the same ratio of ingredients is vital, but just as important are the timing and temperatures at each stage of the brew.
I think there will be a couple of aha moments, to be honest with you.
What makes 120 so difficult to brew is also what makes it special. The high alcohol content of this beer requires 5 times the barley of a normal IPA and 20 times the hops. We'll keep a careful eye on the mash to make sure there's enough food for the yeast to eat during fermentation.
All right, so I just checked the gravity of first wort that I'm sending from the kettle from the mash tun, and the density of that wort is the exact same as what we experienced in the February batch of 2006.
The early signs are good. Brian's got the 120 test batch headed in the right direction. We'll run tests in the QC lab, and if the sensory panel results are good, in 3 months' time, we hope to be once again bottling one of Dogfish's most important beers. The encouraging part of this whole mess is that although Dogfish took a massive financial loss and a big-time setback, we've got the right people in place to turn mistakes like these into something positive. It might be simplifying things, but just as nature makes great wine, I believe it takes the right people to make great beer.